point out that feudal Europe, as I have it dated, reminds us all of when we were in school and the teacher told us about feudalism. The idea of feudalism reminded me of an old joke in the New Yorker about 1970. It shows the Lord and his vassals sitting around the table, and the Lord stands up and says, "And here's to feudalism and all the wonderful nights that make it work." I'm wondering somehow if it was exactly like that. However, I'm sorry to say that that's probably the image that's passed down in the schools, that there is some CEO of feudalism who knows how to make it work through various bureaucrats and other organizers. In fact, we understand that what I'm calling feudal Europe is really a result of the fact that this is a society in turmoil, and they turn to, frankly, the big three: Germanic, Roman, and German traditions. That's right, the big three, in order to devise a kind of working way to basically control this society. I'm starting here in this discussion of the so-called High Middle Ages so we can consider how this society functioned as they believed God meant it to be. Now, you can probably figure out who thought this up, but according to the idea, God ordered the world in three sorts. And of course, number one being his staff, the clergy, and the lords and knights being the fighters because they needed to defend clergy, and then, shall we say, the third order, the feet of the society. Now, you know, classically you could say, well, there's nothing wrong with feet, but they're at the bottom. And these folks were very much at the bottom, those who work. So, those who pray, those who fight, those who work. We are considering, in essence, the second estate as we talk about the feudal world and part of the first. Because sometimes when we say clergy, we could say, oh, they're so high and mighty, they're so important. But you know, most of us aren't bishops and other highfalutin folks. Most of us are just the little Father O'Malley, you know, at Saint such and such, Nowheresville. So we've got to remember that when we talk about that first estate, we always bear that in mind. However, with the second, we pretty much are including everybody because this is a society at war with themselves or with somebody else. Take your pick. The feudal order, then, is based on these ruling groups, whether they are of this first group, clergy, or the second group. And then, of course, everyone else is in some role of subservience. No doubt about that. The fighting, which is endemic to a Germanic society, I mean, that's what we do. When we're not drinking and loving, we're fighting. I mean, that's the big three. It's just, you're not going to say, well, why don't you take up reading? I just, later. to tell us stories. But other than that, it's pretty much about fighting. And if we are fighting, of course, we have to have people to fight for us, and Germanic tradition calls for warriors to fight for their lord. Some of you will remember when we talked about the comitatus, the Germanic concept of the great lord and his warriors. The problem is going to be when these warriors are going to want something more than just, I guess, what today we would call room and board. In apparently olden times, and I mean for these people, olden times meant that the warriors sort of lived in the home of the Lord. And now I think maybe they want more. And wanting more means compensation. And in a medieval society, compensation means land. That's it. That's all we got. Land. So land is all about providing the necessary means for these individuals to support themselves. I think one of the most interesting theories is the idea that the stirrup is responsible for the feudal way of life. Let me explain. Way back in the 8th century, as some of you will remember. Yes. So, yeah, I think we're going to have a pretty serious exam going on. If I say 732, I'd like to have a smile of recognition. But if I can't get that, why don't I just say the Battle of Tours? And then you'll go, oh, yeah, sure, I remember that. That was back in 2015 when we talked about that. Yes, the Battle of Tours. And the idea was, of course, that Martel used for his Frankish forces the stirrup. And as he did so, the costs of maintaining horses, the equipment for both horses and men, and all the rest of it would cause so significant an issue that it was clear these individuals, these warriors, had to be compensated. Just a theory, but it is an interesting and significant one over the years. But there's no doubt that with the collapse of Carolingian authority, we are going into sheer anarchy, which we had a fair amount of anarchy already. But now, with the collapse of what we call the Western Carolingian rulers after Charles the Bald at the end of the 10th century, everyone on the local level simply seizes whatever power there is. This is parochialism at the extreme. It's like the local, and then he has all the royal rights on his end, and he just takes it and keeps it. So, the theory is the dukes and counts are not calling themselves necessarily kings, but they are seizing all authorities they can obtain. And it's most illustrated in the area that I know many of you have visited and loved, Normandy. That is such a beautiful area of France over in the west. And Normandy was, as we'll see later, kind of the showplace of the High Middle Ages. Norman Europe, as one great scholar called them, and again, this is back in the 20s, I think, the supermen of Europe. I don't think they would use terms like that now, but it's the idea of Normans as, remember the Norman invasions of England and Normans in Sicily, Normans in the Crusades, they're everywhere. And at this time, the Dukes of Normandy began to encourage, you might say, the development of a ruling class from themselves on down to other nobles, and from there to their warriors, all based on military service and holding land. Not giving land, but holding land, not unlike perhaps we would do with library books. In other words, we get to use it, but theoretically not keep it. The land would be called fiefs. Some of you remember fiefs, from the Latin. Yes, always it haunts us. Fiefs from feudum, Feudum, and so we get feudalism from that word fief. And fiefs were the grants of land given by lords to their warriors. You are my warrior, and as long as you fight for me, you hold this land. That's the idea. Oh, I've got a really good one, Carol. It just hit me, because Carol and I are Latin buddies. And so whenever I think about these things, I have to share with you. It's called usufruct. Utor uti usasum with fructus. It means you enjoy the fruit. You get, in other words, this is yours in terms of its crops and its other benefits, this land on this fief. But it's still not yours, legally speaking. And there's a whole volume of law based on that. So you can jar this over when you get home, pull out your book, and think about your deponent verbs. And that'll bring you back a lot of good memories, I bet, from school. Right. So, fiefs for military. Now, the term is vassal, and we normally think of vassals as knights and high muckety-mucks, but in fact, I learned many years ago the word vassal comes from a Welsh word meaning boy. So then you think about Tony Soprano and his fellas, and you think, yeah, you know, big, mean, look. Yeah, I mean, you can see that. But over the centuries, it gained this sort of dignified sound like Sir so-and-so, galloping about, doing all these fabulous things. But they start off pretty much like, you talking to me, you know, or something of the sort. I don't think there's too much about it. But over time, that reputation will come up. Now, this kind of authority, popularly known as feudalism, and some historians go crazy here because they consider it far too general a concept to be fitting, is clearly too neat to fit everything, but for pedagogical reasons they teach it this way, as if there was some sort of feudal wand and then it just completely overcomes all of Europe. What we can say is that it is a gradual development over various parts of Europe over the centuries. And again, I'm referring to a political, military, legal system in which the ruling classes are essentially providing land for military service to their subordinates. That's about the easiest way I can say it. We are talking about, of course, a very small, I don't know if it's the 1% as opposed to the 99%, but it's a very small percentage of the medieval world, as you can well imagine, the lords and the warriors. France would be its beginning because, as some of you know, the Norman Conquest brings this sort of style to England and, of course, to Sicily. The empire only in the 12th century. The king in France was regarded as suzerain, which is a nice way of saying he's not the sovereign. Suzerain has a nice ring to it, but essentially it means he's on top, and technically he's over his vassals, but his vassals are beyond his authority. So that means you are rendered very limited in your authority. As we'll see, the French would work with that in order to increase their power, but it's a slow process, because when we get to a map, you will see that the French kings, in fact, held very little of France, simply the area around Paris, if you want to know the truth. So, the fief provided the vassal with his living, and it is kind of on a take it or leave it basis. If you want to give up your fief, be my guest, but if you do, that fief will no longer be yours. Of course, that can lead people to war, and it does, often. There's no great feudal police to come in and clear it up. They just go at it. So it can get pretty wild. But at least with this, you have some assurance of cooperation between the lords and their vassals. Yes, I had to get a pyramid picture for you, because this is something right out of school, because this is the way they teach it. And then, of course, and it looks so neat and it's so wonderful, it's so reassuring in the classroom, don't you think, when you see this and you think everybody knows their place and everybody has a little place to be on the big triangle. And so you say, I wonder if that's like real life. Probably not. But that's our pyramid, and we're sticking to it, okay? But I just wanted you to know that's still the way it goes. But sometimes I wonder if it causes more damage than harm in learning. But maybe not. There seems to be an order to it. And again, there are our feet, the peasants. And there are lots of them. As the evolution occurs, the ceremonial aspects will evolve quite a bit. It'll become a ritual. And of course, the church wants to get involved, because this is supposed to be a Christian society. Therefore, this needs to be Christianized. But it begins with homage. Yes, Carol, from homo, meaning man. Homage, meaning that the vassal will put his hands in the hands of the Lord and promise to serve him. And this, of course, goes back to the Romans and Germans as well. Just basic kind of ceremony, very nice. But with fealty, in comes the priest, because now we promise to be faithful in the name of the Trinity, and if we are lying, we are perjurers and putting our very souls at risk. So there you have it. So fealty is very serious, and once that's over, then we have the investiture, which could be a clod of earth from the fief. And they went through the whole thing. They were very devoted to their rituals and ceremonies. So they go through and they exchange a ceremonial kiss. And so we might have this whole group, the entourage. And so you're part of the group. So this is very big deal, you know. It's yeah, I'm a real vassal, man. I got my land, and so this is supposed to bring them all close. And you say, well, I'm sure he didn't call him your lordship. I wouldn't, because he calls him boss. But I mean, it's that same kind of sense of cronyism, that I am now one of your people, and I will fight for you. Customarily, I love that adverb. Just, you could probably cite as many violations as you can followings, but customarily, the idea is the Lord treats his vassals with respect. Because I always had problems making sure the students understood that serfs and vassals were not in similar positions. A vassal is by no means to be treated in any kind of inferior way. He is one of mine. He is a person of significance. He fights for me. He's one of my buds. Whereas the third group, people who work, are way down there. So it's an entirely different position of subordination. So we're supposed to respect and care for our vassals, and our vassals are supposed to follow us, and they are to fight for us when we need them. They are to provide aid and counsel. We might be thinking about to go to war or not to go to war. That is the question. So, and it's sort of like, well, what do y'all think we all do? And they say, yeah, let's go for it. You know, that kind of thing. I'm not sure. You have to take a vote or have a debate or question Robert's Rules of Order. But I think there would be some consideration. I mean, if they were a little cool on it, you know, you might rethink it if you were the Lord. So that's called aid and counsel. It's like a body of advisors, so to speak. Now, the right of hospitality, that's a difficult one. You know, I remember hearing when I was a boy, somebody, oh, those people stayed so long, I thought they were going to eat us out of house and home. Y'all ever heard that one? Well, that's what some vassals faced when Lord would come, because the Lord wouldn't come and say, oh, I'm just going to be here for a weekend. No. I'm here, and I'm here indefinitely. And I'm bringing the family and the staff. And see, that's all involved in hospitality, and it's not as if, here, let me pay for them. No. It's all on you because you're the vassal. So that can be bad. I think that could be used in negative ways, no doubt. There are other kinds of supports that the vassals are supposed to provide, but eventually they'll actually be able to get out of military service by what's called a scutage, meaning essentially that you can compensate and then you don't have to go, yeah. But that's off in the future. And really, it will benefit lords in a way because they can get a more professional military service instead of people who will probably try to have excuses or try to say, oh, I'm not feeling well, I can't fight next week, or we've all heard them, yes. So basically then, we understand that all of this evolves in different places at different times. And there is no big book, The Rules of Feudalism, that you can go turn to or call a 1-800-Feudal number. It's like, what shall I do? Dear Feudal Hotline, I've got a vassal and he claims they ran out of groceries. How do I insist? Those kind of things. I mean, I think it's a lot of extemporizing, right, in order to make this work. They do have a way of trying to control the amount of fighting they do by announcing that in case of invasions, they provide unlimited service, but in case that the Lord wants to go on an offensive, that their fighting is limited. So fighting can be limited because clearly these fellows have other things to do. They may have other lords. You say, I'm kind of booked that weekend. You know, we're taking on so and so. So can we come in next week? So yeah, I mean, it's not like we're up for war 24/7. No, they have rules. I won't go so far as to call them the vassals union, but I think they have sort of understandings about the amount of fighting that they're willing to do and the circumstances under which they will do it. Yes?
You said they may have other lords.
Yes, we're going to get to that, how that happens. It's like you could be fickle. Say, you're a great lord, but then so are you. You know, multiple. I mean, think about your planner. I mean, how would you get, I got to fight for this one and this one. You can't fight during Lent. I mean, there are certain times it doesn't work out to fight. So, yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to think about it, to think about how they maintain themselves.
What about the oath of loyalty and all?
Well, you're loyal in your heart. Okay, let me, hold on, we're going to get to that very shortly, but I'm glad you asked that because it is complicated. Now, ecclesiastical vassal almost sounds like a contradiction in terms because churchmen shouldn't be fighting, but churchmen naturally control lots of lands. And they control lots of lands because of the fact that land is the only wealth there is. And these individuals who are bishops or abbots are in charge of large amounts of lands. And as a result, rulers often put them in the position of chief vassals. Well, obviously, they shouldn't be fighting, even though some in the early stages probably do. But they can have vassals to fight, and often do. Now, the great thing, as we saw last time when we talked about the Germanic emperors known as Otto, was why don't we put lots of clergy in high positions? Because they cannot have legitimate heirs. Illegitimate heirs, beaucoup. But not legitimate. Therefore, when their term of office ends or whatever, then that's over. However, the question of the heritability of fiefs will become a nagging one because technically, let's face it, it's a rough life. So you get on up there like 30 or something and they're saying, I don't know, you're not fighting kind of like you used to. I don't know, you're kind of losing it. And so what are you going to do? Well, you're going to lose your fief. I mean, and, you know, it's an interesting concept. However, you can imagine these people who had sons are going to say, well, can't we keep it in the family? Because my boy, he's getting big. He's really working out. He's mean. He loves to kill. Can he do the fighting? I think sometimes these lords are going, oh, I don't know. I hate to start that. But clearly, that's where we're going. The lords do eventually have to accept the fact that these fiefs are going to be inherited, so long as the vassal has a son who is old enough and militarily capable enough to assume those responsibilities. Now, clearly, if you had a son and say, "Oh, gee, Dad, do I have to? I would prefer to love the Lord and take a course in Bible and theology." Clearly, this is not what we're looking for, right? I mean, the kid say, "Go on to the monastery." Okay, sorry. You know, I mean, obviously, that sort of individual is not going to work out. But typically, the son would be reared for this bellicose role and would be quite ready, willing, and able to carry out his father's functions. So, and again, the holding lands from many lords will create all kinds of rivalries, disagreements, and believe it or not, over time, a whole body of legal precedents. It's feudal law, F-E-U-D-A-L, feudal law, and they actually talk about it. I don't know if they did that, Frank. I mean, students would tell me sometimes about actually the professor would mention feudal law in class because it has a lot to do with property rights and land possession and so much else in medieval Europe. It's really interesting, I think, to think about land ownership and land possession based on these feudal issues in so much of Europe. Now, the monarchs assigned younger brothers or younger sons these fiefs. They would be their lords, and even if they did not fight, they would have the vassals who could do so. Now notice my second sentence. Church leaders would eventually have great concerns about these roles. Well, you can see why. Who are you working for? Remember the church? Remember why you're in this position? Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very schizophrenic to be a high clergy person at that time. To be a bishop, you are part of this feudal situation. But on the other hand, you still have all these spiritual duties, and you have to think, which is more important? Well, you know, they're both real important. Well, the church leaders will eventually find that to be objectionable, and clearly they'll have to consider the quality of people who are getting these positions, because frankly, many of the leaders of the church are chosen by that dear principle that we love so much in the state of Alabama and elsewhere. It's called nepotism. Okay? Oh, yes. I've got that younger boy, and he loves the Lord. He reads books, and he can name all 4 Gospels. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's quite the thing then to utilize the church for the benefit of your own family members. So we're not surprised about that. And like I say, not necessarily exemplars of piety and religious devotion. So yes, there are a few rotten apples in the church box, no question about that, simply because of their roles in the society. Now, ready to understand the multiple lord concept. Now, kings like to think of themselves as essentially everyone's lord. During the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror, who, as you know, was Duke of Normandy, will essentially insist that when he becomes king of England, everyone from the lowest warrior to the highest had to acknowledge that he was their Lord. He was what they called their liege lord. See, I love all my lords. But when it comes down to it, if push comes to shove, I'm fighting for you. And I'll send one of my vassals to fight for the other lord. Because that might happen. Like I said, schizophrenia. I mean, you got, on the one hand, you're fighting for one lord, and on the other hand, you are technically a vassal to the lord he is fighting. But you can always say, liege lord. And he said, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot. Okay, who you going to send me? Because someone will stand in for you, one of your vassals, to perform that military service. Now, does that make sense? I wonder how that worked. I think there would probably be jealousy issues, or wouldn't you think somebody's feelings could be hurt, or well, why can't I be your liege lord or something like that? But that's what they tell us. Homage, the performance of homage as the heritability of fiefs came in, would mean that every time a lord died and was succeeded by his son, or every time a vassal died and his son came in, there was supposed to be a new ceremony. There is no written contract. We're not there yet. It's all word to word. When we talk about people's word being their bond and all of that, this is the essence of it. And if you are a liar, may you rot in hell. And you are, I'm going to use some strong language, damned perjurer. Yeah. So that's pretty serious. I mean, remember, you took the oath of fealty. And so they take all this lying very seriously in theory. I mean, it goes on all the time. But in theory, it's quite serious. So, even though you might have a lord who's just a teenager, and you might have some crusty old vassal of 35, he must get down on his knees and put his hands in the hands of this little whippersnapper and promise homage and fealty. That always cracks me up. And you can just imagine, he probably hated every minute of it. That kid. Boy. But that is necessary from the legal point of view, the way they viewed it at that time. Now, of course, once the church got more and more involved, you betcha that everything's going to be in writing, especially if a bishop or an abbot of a monastery was the Lord. He's going to want a contract, and he's going to want everything lined up, or else we'll see you in court. And so it will change. But the essence of it, of course, is the word of two people. Then we get all the other obligations. One is, and you think, oh God, these people were as bad as modern people, and what else can they tax, right? So very creative in terms of coming up with revenue enhancements. For example, relief, which essentially is a charge just to get your fief. In other words, it's like, what would you call it? Like packaging, postage and handling, something like that. It's just an extra little charge. Yeah, we're sorry, but the cost of transferring the fief over, so we sort of, we need that because we're getting the fief ready for you, and there was a slight charge. And you think, Oh, really? Well, but that's the way. And then relief just becomes custom, and so, well, your grandfather paid it. What are you griping about? I mean, this is a tradition. I used to hear students say that after 5 years. Say, this is very traditional and all, but I said, oh, really? You know how traditions are. They get going. Now, in addition, and again, this is amazing how typical this became. You can't always say that this was the way it worked everywhere, every time. But the question of aids that were expected from vassals. One, when the eldest son was knighted, so the Lord would have an eldest son, and a knighting is like confirmation, bar mitzvah, and you want to have the band, rent the country club, have the open bar, yeah, that's my boy, and all of that. And so that's a big do, and you say, gosh, the expenses, the catering bill alone. Time for an aid. And it's not like I'm asking, can y'all help? It's not like some plea we would have like outside the grocery store. This is expected. You will provide this. And just so, the first marriage of the eldest daughter.
First marriage?
Yes, ma'am. Because she might well have many opportunities for nuptial bliss or whatever. Because remember, when you say I do to a warrior, you think about it, the chances of widowhood are maximum. Okay? So, yeah. So it's only the first marriage. Don't come back say, well, my widowed daughter, I need another aid. Say, really? Good luck. So, yeah. So it's the first marriage of the eldest daughter and the third aid to pay for the ransom of the Lord. Ransoming was very common in this society. Sometimes, you have your weapon on somebody and you say, I don't know whether to kill him or not. I don't think I will. I think I would just rather keep him and let him pay for him. So that was, I guess that you could say, that brought about many interesting situations, as we will see later. What they call extraordinary aids, which will actually come up when you talk about the evolution of the English Parliament, has to do with negotiating special concessions on the part of the vassals. Like I say, you've got the aids that are due and customary, but if you want something more, and they did, you can go in and say, we really need some help. Things are not looking good. Could we ask, passing the hat? No, I don't think so. I think it's going to have to be more. Let's talk about this. Let's work it out together, and maybe we can come up and help you out, Lord. But if we do that, what's in it for us? Well, that's the way it works. We negotiate. That whole idea of revenues working that way. It is legal, and sometimes people end these things. In fact, you can get rid of your vassal, and I love this word, declaring him contumacious. I have never heard this word used in any other context except that of the feudal relationship. A contumacious vassal has in some way broken his pledge, and therefore he is no longer worthy of his fief. And so technically, the vassal should say, gee whiz, we better pack up, baby, because we're going to have to leave. I've been found contumacious. And I just don't think it's going to happen that way. But let's have a war about it, right? And so that would happen. And, of course, then the so-called diffidatio, when the vassal will deny his pledge to the Lord, saying the Lord is unworthy. You say, well, it sounds like there are going to be a lot of wars. Oh, yeah. I mean, if you would fight over any of these things, some vassals would agree with the vassal in trouble. Some would follow the Lord, depending on what each person's, individual ambitions were. And finally, the concept of escheat, another good legal word, having to do with land possession. There is not a male heir, and therefore it escheats to the Lord. That's what it means. It reverts to the Lord because there is no one who is legally qualified to carry out those responsibilities. Perhaps you can, in some cases, have a daughter and she has a husband who's capable of doing it, and that might have been approved. But in many cases, it's escheat simply because the fief is no longer able to be held by an individual who can't do the particular requirements for it. And now, as we turn to the gender not mentioned, let's take our break. I have now 20 past 3. So, and I'm counting. You have 5 minutes. Thank you for bringing that up, because that is a fascinating issue, isn't it? The whole idea of you have all of these different, to each one, but one, it's like if you wanted to have a lot of different boyfriends, but you said, you are my main man, and I go out with you on Saturdays, and the others I can see maybe on Mondays, or maybe go to church with them. but the night, the big night, you're it. You're my liege boyfriend. I think it's fascinating.
No wonder they were worrying all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
this lady had 2 daughters that were in your class. David Shamp, my son, I believe, took it, but Bonnie Jean Shamp.
oh my goodness.
She really appreciated Kicklighter. They called him Kicklighter.
Yeah, that's me.
Professor, thank you. And
Thank you. Oh, you're in the class too. Oh, wonderful.
All right, so
Very good.
this morning.
Well, please remember me to your children.
Well, my son's going to teach history also.
Oh, he is. David's going to be a teacher.
David is, he's over at Smith Station doing some practice teaching right now.
Well, that's a good school,
He's an
too.
Auburn 5th-year program trying to pick up a teaching certificate.
So that's I love they have that 5th year, because that means they get their degree in history, but then they get their education.
Just loves it. And this medieval, Bonnie loved the medieval. Bonnie Jean
She sure did.
Champ, she loves the...
Oh,
Thank you very much.
brings back a lot of good memories. Thank
Yes, sir.
you.
Thank you very
But I can't believe it. Yeah. Yeah. Those parents, right? When Donna, remember when she saw the one at the, said, I had you and my daughters had you too. Yeah. 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 I knew it was time to leave before that happened. Well, now do you have all the details for the big do Friday night? Eric is 25 years old, a quarter of a century.
Yeah, we're going over the...
Because I kept saying...
Okay, by me. No, we've been one of them.
What's that?
Irish red velvet.
Oh, yeah. They're going to Opelika. His girlfriend... Didn't she decide the restaurant? Didn't Mara decide the restaurant? His girlfriend? I thought so. That wasn't... Okay. And I think I told you, Susie, they live in Midtown Franklin. You never seen the sign for the Franklin exit? When you're driving to Auburn, yeah. Oh, you thought I meant another Franklin. No, no, no. I mean, we're talking country. All these years in Auburn, and I've never been to Franklin, Alabama. See? I mean, it is an unknown, perhaps. Georgia. Not. It's a little town called Hawkinsville. It's in the middle of the state. It's near Macon, near Robbins Air Force Base.
Yeah, my son was born in Macon.
In Macon. Well, see, in Hawkinsville, we thought that was a big city.
I'm sure.
Yes.
I'm sure you did.
That's where I got my clothes and went to the dentist, and I mean, that was big doings.
I'm pretty sure you taught my son Patrick right. Patrick right.
Oh my gosh.
Probably don't. I just texted him. I said, did you? I had 3 kids that went home.
You had 3?
Well,
What years? The reason I ask you is I was wondering how our tuition rates were. I hope for your sake they were less.
not paying off Auburn University student loans. Let me put it that way. Okay. Because that was on their dad and me.
Oh.
But they went on to graduate school. And they're all paying off. They're all, because we had,
Yes.
they had to pay them off. That was the deal.
I had students who would come to me and want to talk about doing, advanced work in history, and then they would say, well, are my parents going to pay? And I said, indeed not. It's got, the tap's got to run out on you. You got 21 years old, you got a bachelor's degree, you pay. And this was a concept they weren't.
The idea was that validates their sincerity.
Of course.
Okay, if we're paying,
It's not the same. And I said, you walk up and down the hall and you ask any professor if their parents paid for them, and the answer is no. I mean, we all have, if you had to work or you have a grant or something, but nobody goes to mom and daddy and say, that just cracked me up though, where they thought, because that just doesn't happen. Because people don't have that. Well, I mean, most normal people don't have.
that he had to. His son Patrick, I know he talked about you. And he never talked about any professor. So it was in a good way, you know.
Oh, good.
You were memorable.
Well, you tell Patrick about Leach Homage then, so that we can.
I'll ask him what class was it. So did you always teach history? Feudal?
I taught all kinds of history, yeah. But I mean, I taught the required. That's what you're thinking. Medieval, this is what I do. Hey, Jane.
Okay. All right.
All right, I think we are ready.
Was that the requirement? Was that?
It was all of it, from Adam and Eve to Nixon. That was what I promised them in September. You know, that was a long time ago, right? So I didn't go into the Ford administration. So, but yeah, it's a little bit of this, the great sweep of history and all that. Okay. No, all year.
Oh, the whole
3 quarters or 2 semesters.
That's a big squad.
No, Lord, no. We got them for all year. They had to do the whole 9 yards. Okay, let's get started. It is time to talk about how do women of the noble class fit into this particular feudal world, and it is a very interesting one. Some people say, oh, well, this would just be wonderful to be a woman of the noble class in the high Middle Ages. And I say, really? So I don't know. I'll let you be the judge as we go through it. Essentially, noble women were used to develop male relationships. They were used as for marriage purposes. kings, the more daughters they had, the more were married off to other rulers. And if they did not, you'd think, well, what would you do? Would you just stay there in court? Well, maybe if you were Charlemagne's daughter. But that's the only example I can think of. The life for someone who was not married would be that of a convent resident. So that's it. Either you are going to be married and have some role in political relationships, or you pursue the religious life, willingly or not. The production of male heirs was, well, very important. It was the sine qua non of successful marriages. And I'm sure, like Consuelo Vanderbilt said, some of you will remember, to the Duke of Marlborough, I produced the heir and the spare, because she had the two sons, you'll remember, by the Duke of Marlborough. And that was the ticket to have the two, because they were legitimate. No matter how many other children he might have illegitimately, it didn't count in terms of inheritance. And that's, of course, what this is all about. Dowries made possible expansions of land, new relationships, and the dukes of Normandy and other rulers would use these kinds of opportunities with great effect. Although technically, the bride had legal rights over their own dowries. The men, as husbands, could sometimes, and did, use them for their own purposes. It was a male-dominated world. There was always some man around to tell you what to do, whether it was the father, whether it was the husband, and of course getting all the way down to the son. So I've come across cases of widows who did seem to be in charge, but they are rare and impressive when they do so, because I'm always thinking, how on earth did they manage? The requirements of this society in terms of male control were very powerful indeed. Part of their problem was the technical inability to do homage and fealty because of their gender. In other words, you could not say, well, I feel like I could do the fighting. Well, no, you can't. And while exceptions might be made for male clergy in terms of doing fealty and homage, even though they didn't fight, the same exceptions would supposedly not be made for a woman. Therefore, if women did not do fealty and homage, that essentially eliminates them, or supposedly, from this focus of legal and political power. However, then comes reality. Reality is, I've found examples of women acting in situations of vassalage or lordship because, as widows or in other capacities, there would be no man to tell them what to do, and therefore they would be able to act. And again, you will notice I mentioned forced marriages. It was hard to stay unmarried. It wasn't like you were going to try to meet somebody. Believe me, they were lining up to meet you. And it wasn't because of your looks either. It was because of your lands. And that, of course, created great problems because often with many of the powerful widows, the king would want to get one of his henchmen married to these women so then he could control their property. Maybe their sons would put up a fuss. But in many cases you can see all the wrangling. And not surprisingly, this will be a major issue in Magna Carta in 1215. The idea of forcing people to marry. And technically, the church did not recognize marriages when they were forced, but that's a technicality, I dare say. I'm sure it happened many times to unwitting brides. To be independent would often, as I've already said, require you to follow the religious life. And it is not surprising that many widows would choose the religious life to spend out the rest of their lives. And that's because, of course, this would relieve them of that male authority. Now, the priests would still have some authority over their lives since it is a male clergy, but in terms of leadership roles, and remember these are the great ladies of the society, so they're not going in as little nun or something like that. They're going in positions of authority. So it is not surprising. We often find abbesses and other great women religious as being widows, not young folks who went in when they started off life. Now, chivalry. How do we clean these folks up? How do we make them chivalrous? Boy, we've got our work cut out for us. Because they often talk about how people gradually learn to use, instruments to eat. And I mean, just the basic things, or bathe, or those kinds of things. And you think, all of that's coming, but not right away. This develops step by step because these are rough people. The word chivalry itself comes from chevalier, having to do with horses, horsemen. And so it doesn't seem to have the kind of meanings that we put upon it, as in, why, he's so chivalrous. We don't hear that too much anymore, but there was a time when that was not an uncommon expression. Well, the idea of chivalry, again, perhaps not surprisingly, comes from the church. Some of our first accounts of the chivalrous knights comes, perhaps surprisingly to some, from the church, who insisted that knights were fighting for justice, righteousness, and the Christian way. And some of these knights may well have responded to this by, because they hadn't heard this. The word hadn't gotten out to them. But this is the image. God has called you to this high calling. You are to defend the churchmen. You are to look after the poor and the humble, etc. And that's what this is all about. This, whether or not it had any effects, it certainly is the imagery that is portrayed in the church's literature about knights and their duty. And we will certainly get this by the time of the 12th century, when images of the ideal knights will become more common in literature. bravery, honor, truthfulness, courtesy, generosity. I mean, what's not to love? These people are so wonderful. One of the most famous stories of chivalry is, of course, the Song of Roland. I guess do they still do that in literature classes, I guess? I don't know. But it used to be a very common work, and it is the church's variety of chivalry because, of course, Roland is devoted to his Lord. But you say, which Lord? Both Lords. Charlemagne and, of course, the Lord above. And when the valiant Roland is beaten down by treacherous Muslims, supposedly, then, of course, he cries out in prayer, and as he is dying, the angels of God will come down and get him, pick him up, because he has fulfilled the image of Christian knighthood. So Roland is he's wonderful. But, you know, that is what it's about. It's not about me. I'm just Roland. It's about my Lord's and my service to the cause of righteousness versus the wicked and evil and treacherous, who are all going to hell. And I've got a special escort to go to eternity. Here they come. And that's the angels, see, coming. And they're coming. So it's like a special escort. Pretty good. Pretty good. Of course, the church needs to benefit, and the church does have its enemies, and they're growing, and we need to be out there and be on the alert. So technically, if you're a Christian knight and I'm a Christian knight, we shouldn't be killing each other or mutilating. I mean, you know, we should be together. We're all on the same team here. So there is a sense of knights being vigilant and fighting against the enemies. And who are the enemies? Well, clearly non-Christians. And we will see, as we move on, the various forms this activity should be taking. There is another angle, and again, this too makes literature. The courtly love sagas, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and all the rest. And it's a fascinating twist to the ideas of homage and fealty, because it seems to us, oh, how do they say it? You're living a lie. The vassal is supposed to provide homage and fealty to his lord. However, he is in love with the wife of his lord, and she has feelings for him, and you say, oh no, you mean, yes I do. Betrayal, lust, and a whole range of evils, but juicy writing, very good writing. And this idea of love being the basis for the knight's ardor, for his daring do, will become an important theme in this sort of literature, even though clearly it involves perjury. I'm calling it what it is, because clearly he was supposed to follow his Lord, and committing adultery with your Lord's wife is not one of those, oh, it just happened, it was just that one time, we didn't mean it, we really care deeply about you. No, there's something really off here. But who cares about him? It's about us. And we love each other, even though we know that we'll never be together forever. But hey, This is romance, not reality. So, you say, does she have to be noble? Oh, yes. Let's not even dream of we're going to go into a different class. That's just sex. This is romantic love, and this is serious. And the stories about this will be very, very significant in the literature of the 12th century. So, the tale of great deeds, Chanson de Geste, the Song of Roland, and by the way, what about his lady friend? Well, he never says one thing about her. He's just worried about having served the Lord and getting to heaven. But his affianced is at the court of Charlemagne and promptly drops dead when she finds out. So, yeah. So it's kind of one-sided. He ain't got time, for that. Because he's worried about the Lord, and Charlemagne. Not any women. However, then you see those looks, those glances, lascivious glances that they are making, and you say, I see trouble for Fealdian homage dead ahead. But it's true homage. It's love homage, that kind of thing. So very, very interesting how that fits in. And I actually had a student in the medieval class ask me, she said, so this is a form of women's liberation. I said, no, I don't think it's so much. I really don't see this connected to that particular movement. But it does express the fact that even in this male-dominated society, that obviously women have to play a major part, even though it is so controlled by the roles that they have to assume. And now, everybody else. This, of course, means most of the people, including ordinary clergy. I might say that with the growth of Christianity, more and more people will be put into clerical positions. It can be a pretty good position, and unlike modern times, it does not necessarily mean a great deal of education, although that would be helpful. In many cases, it does not mean even that you must be continent, because we find many instances of clergy having companionship. All of which is to say that with the spreading of this status, all sorts and kinds of males will join the ranks to produce a clergy which is essentially of peasant stock. So I just can't stress that too much, that the masses of clergy are not of the upper classes and do not necessarily possess a great deal of education. I mean, if they know a few words, they know more than their parishioners do, right? So, and they can fake the rest. So I would imagine, and you are dealing essentially with a society of uneducated people. So we're not surprised that for a long, long time we see that in existence. And of course that is a very great problem for the spread of Christianity. Peasants. I always like to say that to call someone a peasant today is not a kind thing to do. But when you're talking about medieval, you are simply referring to a classification of people who work with the soil. And that means nothing good or bad. It simply means a status. A majority of people was clearly, until massive agricultural changes in the 18th century, most people in this society will of necessity be involved with growing, and not very skillfully or effectively. So it is what today would be deemed an undeveloped society. It is a society where disease and famine are very common, and it is a society where life is very hard and very insecure. Ergo, protection. And yet another ism. This ism is called manorialism. And like teachers of yore, I too separate feudalism from manorialism by insisting that manorialism has to do with agriculture and the masses of peasantry and their particular life. Whereas I see feudalism as involving the minority and entailing military and political forms of authority. The manors are agricultural units. We still have the expression, I think, the Lord of the Manor, right? The Lord of the Manor. And that sounds wonderful, but I don't think we should think of Tara or 12 Oaks here. I think we would be better off just to understand that the manor is this great estate which may or may not be equivalent to a fief. But a fief is not necessarily a manor. It could be two manors. It could be part of a manor. You don't know that you can't say they are synonyms. Fief is a legal term. Manor is a real term of agriculture consisting of a number of acres of land, some of which is arable, that is, capable of growing crops, with the rest of the land used for other purposes, some of which is residential.
So it doesn't have anything to do with housing?
No, we got the house. There's a house. We got our manor. And this is the typical manor. I always loved that. Of course, it never existed, but the idea is you got to have some kind of show place, so this is it. And the idea is you see the manor house. You see the way down there, it'd be on your right. See the manor house. And then see the wasteland, see the village. All right, that's where all your regular folks live. And then you've got all your arable land. So you have a fallow field, you're letting it rest. And you say, that's just awful. Because they can't even, because that's all they know is to give it some time off. It's got a sabbatical.
Would they have to build a wall around their manor?
No, the Lord is supposed to be protecting them. That's the reason they're under the Lord of the Manor, is because they work for him, more or less. And in exchange, he takes care of them. So the idea of a wall is going to come up with towns and cities, but I'm not aware of any walls with these farms, these manors. And you can see the oven, the press, the gardens, and so you have rotations, at first just 2 fields and then eventually 3. They are collectively farmed. The idea of an independent, this is my land, man, you can't come on this, no trespass. No, we're not doing any of that. This is not that kind of world. This is collective. We share in the work, we share in the crops. Because, believe you me, there's barely enough for those who are there. You know, it's so fascinating in our world to think that when they saw someone who was, well, let's be nice, pleasingly plump, they would just say, wow, you are cool. You look great. I mean, you know, somebody... Why? Because they said, how did you get that way? I mean, because these folks are thin. Because they don't do a lot of eating. It is a very, very poor, undernourished people in the medieval world. So it fascinates me when you hear stories of, usually nobles, who put a few extra pounds on, they are really like, wow, what kind of life? You must have had a great life. You know, this is good to be big. So, I mean, we're just the opposite now, aren't we? Now, we hear about serfs. But serfs are only one kind of peasant. Serfs are people who are not slaves. This is not a society that can afford a slavery. Did you know slavery is expensive? I mean, you have to look after folks. And sometimes your slaves can't work anymore. And yet, you just don't turn them out usually. But this society, slavery is dying out. I think it's about gone by 10th century, maybe 11th. Instead, there's a state of serfdom, and that means peasants who are hereditarily bound to the soil. You can't sell them. You can't get rid of them because they have rights on that land. But at the same time, they do not have personal freedom. Many will get that personal freedom eventually, but that is the lowest status for the peasant. And they work the lands just like other peasants do. And everyone has their own relationship, you might say, with the Lord and his kinds of control. Manumission was thought to be a good thing for the spiritual welfare of the manumitter. Not to say that serfdom was not accepted by the Christian religion as a state. I mean, we're all in bondage to sin in a certain way. And so some human beings are in bondage to earthly lords. You know, it can be rationalized in those ways. However, manumission of an individual from serfdom merely meant that that individual and the family was now free. And then people say, well, then could they go? What were the career options? I said, none. I said, yeah, look around and maybe have some testing and see, maybe I want to go to med school. No, I mean, it just, you go out the next day and guess what you'll be doing? Picking and hoeing. What'd you do yesterday? Picking and hoeing. You're just not a serf anymore. So that's a very interesting, it's not a static position then. I think that's the best way. So there are other kinds of peasants who owe various services. They have freedom to starve or freedom to eat if you grow the crops. I mean, but it's not freedom in the sense of new opportunities. And let me note at the same time that while they are free, they do have to pay various kinds of taxes and work responsibilities for the luxury of their freedom. And it is inherited. If your parents are serfs, then you are a serf. And so it's very important, I would think, that when people are able to obtain that status, they would have done so. And in some ways, perhaps, that would have been good for the Lord as well. Because serfdom, as I say, is derived from slavery, but it is not a state in which the Lord has an economic responsibility for you. It simply means you lack personal freedom. Got just a minute. So I just want to give you an example. You've heard that old expression, they just nickel and dime us to death. That's the way this society does. Look at some of these taxes. A general tenant tax on unfree landholders. So you hold land, but you lack personal freedom, and therefore you have to pay additional fees. You say, well, that doesn't seem right. Really? Well, what do you want to do about it? There's really nothing you can do. You pay when you use like the hose or animals or the mills or the ovens. Every kind of manorial institution, of course, is owned by the Lord. And don't think about shopping around, okay? No, no, no. That's a no-no. You will use this one and this one alone. Tax to marry one's daughter. You know why? Because I might well lose the services of her children to be. And I'm sad about that, so I need to have some sort of compensation. And finally, this is really low. The area, the death duty, you say, wow, estate taxes. Right, our best animal. Bessie, we're going to miss you. You know? Yeah, I know. Man, you've been a fine cow. I've just loved every moment with you, but hey, you're going to, since the main man's gone, and the family's thinking, gosh, we need that cow. But that's this death duty or tax. So to say that this is a hard, cruel life is a very, very clear point. And this is how the mass of people live. Although there are others who are neither peasants nor lords. And we shall begin there next week. Thank you very much. Thank you all.